She was there when no one else wanted to be. She knew how to keep quiet when others talked too much. And behind that simple maid's uniform lived the most sincere love he would ever have in his life. The millionaire, however, only remembered her when the lights went out and the applause died down. He called her my home in secret, but in front of his friends, he reduced her to silence. And on that particular night, when everyone laughed and he humiliated her with a cutting comment about different worlds, she just smiled. But inside, something broke forever. What he didn't know is that the emptiness left by her would one day echo even in the walls of the mansion he said was his. But that was only warm when she was there. After that dinner, everything seemed the same in his house. The silverware was shining. The piano was playing soft music. The servants were moving around with the same discipline. But there was something that no one could name. Absence. It was as if the soul of the house had gone with it. Because no matter how much money he had, the power to buy it back he never had. What began as a silent and hidden love ended as a bitter lesson that not even his millions could avoid. And what seemed like a secret passion behind the scenes would become the most painful memory of his life. Karma doesn't speak loudly, but when it arrives, it is impossible to ignore. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. The mansion had windows so large that the sunset seemed to enter through them. Everything there was impeccable. The marble shone as if it had been polished with vanity. The chandeliers sparkled with arrogance, and the footsteps of the servants echoed with timed discipline. But there was one place in that house where time did not follow these rules. The kitchen. That was where she lived, among hot pots, folded towels, and silences that said more than words. Her name was Eleanor. No one knew her last name. No one asked. To the guests, she was just the girl who serves. But to the owner of the house, she was everything he pretended not to need. His name was Ethan Grayson. He was a young millionaire and the heir to a fortune built on steel and silence. He had everything money could buy, except the courage to admit what he felt. The first time he saw her, she was cleaning a wine stain on the tablecloth in the dining room. The guests had already left. She didn't see him approaching. He watched her in silence for a few seconds, and instead of giving her orders, he simply said, "You make this house feel alive." She didn't answer. She smiled. A short, simple, almost imperceptible smile. And it was there, in the interval between the last glass being washed and the sound of the coffee machine, that their story began. No one ever knew exactly how the two came to see each other more than they should have. There was no confession. There was no touching, but there was something, a kind of silent tenderness that only the two of them understood. She prepared his coffee with more care than the others. He, in turn, noticed whether she wore a coat on cold days, and on silent nights when the piano played alone in the empty room, he watched her walk through the door with a heavy heart, wishing she would stay, but never asking. Because asking would be assuming, and assuming would be disobeying all the invisible rules that sustained that world of appearances. Elena knew it. She knew she was just a presence he loved behind the scenes, but she also knew the power she held, the power to transform a house worth millions into a real home. Still, she was content with the small moments, with the way he called her home when he was drunk with longing and empty of pride. She listened to it, with her eyes closed, as if she knew it would never leave his bedroom door. It was a silent love, but it was love, until the day he had to choose between that love and the image he projected to others. And then he broke everything. The first time Ethan asked her if she wanted to have dinner with him, he didn't say anything. He just left 2 plates on the table on the back porch and waited. She understood, and she did. They didn't exchange more than 5 sentences that night, but there was enough silence for them to hear each other inside. The world seemed smaller when they were there. Far from the noisy hallways of the mansion, the high heels that echoed at social events, the fake smiles of those who applauded his money but wouldn't know how to love him if everything fell apart. Eleanor, with her worn apron and hands full of work marks, looked at him as if she saw something no one else could, the scared boy behind the powerful man. She never asked why he treated her differently. She never demanded anything. She never asked for anything. And maybe that was exactly what kept him hooked on her. Because Elena didn't want his money, his inheritance, his fame. She just wanted to be there, when the coffee was ready, when they exchanged glances after a tiring day, when she took care of the linen tablecloth that he always left stained through carelessness. Ethan began to seek her out with his eyes, even when he was surrounded by others. It was as if her presence served as a point of balance in a world of excess, a slice of reality in a theater where everyone wore expensive masks. Little by little, small habits became refuges. He began to wait for her near the kitchen. He asked her trivial questions just to hear her talk, and when she answered in that calm way, almost too serene for that house of haste and ostentation, he felt that he didn't need to be anything other than what he was. Elena, in turn, observed everything with her feet on the ground. She knew that he was the owner of everything there, but she also knew that there were no contracts between them, only gestures. The problem was that the world outside was not made of gestures. It was made of appearances, surnames, parties, and conventions, and her place, according to everyone else, was serving at the table, not sitting at it. Ethan didn't talk about it. He didn't say what he felt, not to her, not to himself. But on nights when he couldn't sleep, he would stop in the hallway leading to the servants' quarters in silence. He didn't knock on the door. He just sat there, like someone who's approaching something precious but doesn't feel worthy of touching it. And when she noticed and slowly opened the door, he would make up some excuse. "Is everything okay with the plumbing?" Or, "Have you seen my blue tie?" Elena smiled, like someone who understood the game, like someone who knows that sometimes love doesn't shout. It whispers through meaningless excuses. There was an unspoken promise between them, a feeling in suspense, ready to fall from the branch at any moment. But time passed, and what was once enchantment began to become doubt. How long would she accept being just part of a secret? How long would he hide what he most wanted to show? What seemed beautiful at first began to hurt in silence, because love that hides too much one day loses sight. Over the next few weeks, what had once been a silent harmony began to unravel. Elena no longer smiled as lightly. Her steps became shorter, her eyes more alert, as if searching for signs that something was about to end. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed increasingly torn between what he felt and what was around him. The parties got bigger, visitors became more frequent. Friends, investors, women too dressed up for simple lunches began to occupy the spaces in the mansion, and at each of these events she became invisible again. The woman who served dessert, the one who lowered her eyes when someone dropped a glass, the one who overheard, without meaning to, the whispered comments between laughter. "Has this girl worked here for a long time?" they asked. "She's just a trusted employee. She knows how to stay in her place," he replied, almost without thinking, and every time he said it, it was like he was throwing dirt over something alive that was still trying to breathe inside. Elena didn't complain. She'd never been one to ask for explanations, but her hands shook as she wiped the crystal glasses. It wasn't fear. It was the pain of realizing that what seemed so intense in the shadows couldn't withstand the light. Ethan knew. He knew he was hurting someone who didn't deserve it, but he was caught between pride and cowardice. The problem with growing up surrounded by people who put a price on everything is that, at some point, you forget that there are things you can't buy, and Elena's love was one of them. One of those nights after a dinner filled with investors and loud laughter, he found her gathering napkins in the garden. It was cold, and yet she wasn't wearing a coat. He approached her and tried to break the ice with some random comment, but she didn't respond. She just continued folding the fabric calmly, as if her hands were hiding her tight heart. Ethan stood there, waiting for something, anything, but she just looked at him, as if asking for an answer that she already knew wouldn't come. And indeed, he didn't. He fell silent, not out of disdain, but because he didn't know how to face his own reflection. Because loving someone who reminds you of your truth can be scary, And Elena was the most honest mirror he'd ever had. From that moment on, everything changed without them saying a word. She started leaving earlier, avoiding the times when he usually came down. And he, in turn, started walking around the house with the strange feeling of being surrounded by people, but completely alone. And when he looked into the kitchen and didn't see her there, he felt like he had lost something. But he didn't know what yet. Her absence hurt, but her silence, that was starting to deafen. That Friday the mansion was lit up like it was an out-of-season Christmas. There were lights everywhere, waiters circulating with silver trays, violins echoing classical music, and a parade of sparkling dresses that exuded perfume and superiority. It was the most important event of the year for the Graysons, a celebration of closed deals, renewed partnerships, and most importantly, a way to show the world that the family empire was still growing. Elena knew what this kind of night meant, being invisible more than ever. She would spend hours pacing back and forth, serving people who didn't even notice her presence, and listening to the laughter that sounded like silent slaps to her dignity. But that night, something was different. Ethan saw her before anyone else. She wore her hair tied up simply, as always, but she had chosen a pair of small, discreet earrings that seemed to try to remind her that she was still a woman, still someone. When he saw her enter the room with a tray, his heart sank. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was longing, but it was feeling, and it was strong. She walked past him as if she didn't know him, and in a way, she really didn't, because the Ethan of the private dinners, the silent coffees, the nights in the hallway, that man wasn't there. The one who showed off in front of his friends was another, more erect, more rough, more empty. One of the guests commented loudly, with a mocking smile, "That girl? She works here, doesn't she? Too pretty to be just a maid." And before anyone else could laugh or change the subject, Ethan replied, quickly, coldly, defensively, "She's just that. She works here, but she's not from our world." The words came out with the precision of a sharp knife, and by misfortune, or perhaps justice, she heard them. Elena didn't drop the tray. She didn't show any outrage. She didn't cry. She just looked at him for a moment that seemed suspended in time and smiled, a smile so serene that it was painful. Then she turned and continued on her way, as if she hadn't heard anything, but inside, what he had just done had broken the last thread of something she cared for so dearly. The night went on like all the others. Gifts, speeches, music. But Ethan could no longer hear anything. Elena's presence, which had previously filled the house even in silence, was now a noisy void, a space that screamed for her absence. He tried to find her before the party ended. He went to the kitchen, to the servants' quarters, to the back of the house. But she was already gone. With the same delicacy that always went unnoticed, Elena left without a trace. And for the first time, he had no control over anything. The next day, the mansion woke up sick. Nothing was out of place, but everything seemed wrong. The coffee arrived cold, the silverware was out of alignment, the kitchen smelled different. But what really disturbed Ethan was the absence he couldn't explain. The chair by the window, where she usually sat to take off her shoes at the end of the day, was empty. And it wasn't just her physical absence that bothered him. It was the realization that he had done exactly what he swore he would never do. He had treated something that was irreplaceable as disposable. He didn't ask the other employees about her. He didn't need to. He knew she wouldn't be back. There had been an irreversible decision in her eyes the night before, and that was what hurt. Not her absence, but the certainty that he had been the one responsible for making her permanent. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to fill her space with obligations, meetings, trips, parties, everything that always filled his schedule, but never his heart. He hired a new housekeeper, then another and another. None of them stayed. Not because they were incompetent, but because none of them could make the house breathe the way Elena did. It was as if the air inside had changed. The furniture was in the same place, the lights kept turning on the same way, but the soul of the house was gone. One morning, he found an old note inside one of the books he used to pretend to read. It was from the time Eleanor had organized his library on her own, because she said that books deserved to be near the people who actually read them. The note had a simple list: strong coffee, white flowers, sunshine in the morning. These were the three things she said would cure any sadness. Ethan held on to the paper like it was a relic, like it was one last chance to go back. But there was no going back. He tried to find her. He asked one of the drivers to investigate discreetly, but the answer was vague. She didn't leave an address. She just said she wouldn't be back. That was when Ethan realized Eleanor wasn't trying to make him chase her. She had simply realized her worth and withdrawn, not out of pride, but out of dignity. Alone in his huge mansion, surrounded by everything and everyone, he felt something he had never felt before: the pain of a lost love that was not taken, nor stolen, nor torn away. It was wasted, and that kind of loss cannot be fixed. That night, he went down to the kitchen and made his own coffee for the first time. He measured it wrong, burned his hand and spilled the grounds, but he didn't complain. He sat at the table, holding the crooked mug, and stayed there for hours, in silence, in the same chair where she used to rest. It was his belated attempt to be close, to relive, even if only for a few minutes, what he himself had destroyed. Time passed, not quickly nor gently. It dragged on, like a thin rope that slowly cuts. Ethan went on with his life as best he could. Businesses prospered, stocks rose, contracts were signed. But he walked through the rooms as if he were walking through a museum of things that no longer have meaning. He was no longer the same man. Something in him had shrunk, gone silent. And no matter how hard he tried to maintain the image, he always had, the impenetrable, successful, unshakable millionaire. His eyes gave him away, the eyes of someone who had seen love up close and pushed it away with his own hands. Sometimes he would come down early before the servants woke up, just to walk around the empty house. He would touch the banister that she cleaned every day, look at the glass vase that she changed with new flowers every Monday, and feel a longing that hurt his body. It wasn't just longing for her. It was longing for who he was when she was around. Someone more human, simpler, lighter. Without realizing it, he had become a hostage to her absence. And what had once been a life full of achievements turned into a succession of days that he could barely bear. One night, an unexpected visitor shook his foundations. An old childhood friend, now influential in the same circle of millionaires he used to hang out with, came to his house for dinner. They talked about business, laughed about old stories, and at one point, she said, "This house has changed. It's colder. It smells like absence." Ethan, who had already had more to drink than necessary, simply replied, "She's gone." His friend didn't understand, but he didn't explain either. After that, he decided to stop pretending. He fired his new kitchen staff, cancelled social events and started working from home. There was no point in impressing others anymore. He spent his days reviewing old contracts, organizing files, trying to keep his mind occupied. But every time he found something that reminded him of Elena, his chest ached again. A spoon that had been misplaced, a towel that still smelled of her sweet scent, a notebook with recipes she would never make there again. It was then that she noticed something curious. The plants on the balcony were dying. The same ones that she carefully watered every morning. He had never cared about it. But now, faced with those dry leaves, she felt as if the house was crying out for her too. As if even the nature inside missed her. And for the first time, Ethan watered the plants. With clumsy hands, he threw too much water, got wet, got his shoes dirty, but he kept going. Because it was the least I could do for everything she represented, and maybe, just maybe, it was a way of apologizing, even if silently, even if too late. The following days were marked by repetitions. Ethan woke up early, went downstairs slowly, drank a coffee that was too bitter, and walked around the house without rushing, as if he expected to find traces of her between the walls. He tried to resume old habits, tried to go out with friends, tried to smile when someone started a conversation at business dinners. But inside, everything sounded hollow. There was no more lightness. All that remained was the memory. And the memory, when it cannot be shared with the person who caused it, becomes a ghost. One afternoon, while reviewing old documents, Ethan found a file with her name on it in the bottom corner of a forgotten spreadsheet, just Elena M. Dorsey. That paralyzed him. He had never heard her last name, had never asked her. At that moment, he realized how little he knew about her. He knew her habits, her tastes, her way of walking and smiling, but he didn't know her story. And maybe that was why he had lost her, because he had never been interested in who she was outside of that. With the name in hand, Ethan made an impulsive decision. He searched through records for any clue as to where she might be. After days, he found a clue, a small coffee shop in rural North Carolina, whose employee list listed an Elena Dorsey. The name was common, but his heart told him it was her. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to look fragile. He got in his car and drove for hours without telling anyone, without planning what he would say. When he arrived, he found a simple place with open windows and the smell of fresh cake. At the counter, a woman was smiling at an elderly customer, helping him count coins. She had her hair tied up the same calm manner as always, and when she looked up, she saw Ethan standing in the doorway, hesitant, with his hands in his pockets. There was no surprise in his eyes, no pain, no anger, just serenity. She approached slowly and asked, as if asking politely, "Coffee?" He nodded. They sat in silence, as before, but without the same ground under their feet. He wanted to ask for forgiveness. He wanted to say that her absence was greater than all the presences he had had since then, but he said nothing, because he knew that it was no longer the time. She was at peace, she had healed. And he, not yet. They drank their coffee until the end. She smiled gently as she stood up, wished him luck, and returned to the counter. Ethan stood there for a few more minutes trying to figure out what he had missed, and the answer was simple. Everything. Back at the mansion, Ethan entered as if he were invading a sacred place after desecrating. Nothing had changed, and perhaps that hurt more than any visible transformation. The flowers were still being replaced by a new team, the towels were folded, the piano was still in tune. But he was no longer the same. He now carried the awareness that none of it mattered without her. Elena's absence was not just physical, it was structural. She had supported that space without knowing it, like invisible roots that kept the house standing. And now that she was gone, the structure creaked in. Silence. That night, Ethan went upstairs without turning on any lights. He opened the window, letting in the cold air, and sat in the armchair where he had so often imagined her sitting, reading, or simply existing. In his hands, he held a folded napkin, the last one she had left on the tray that night at dinner before she disappeared. He kept it as if it were an heirloom. The fabric had a small, discreet embroidery with a white flower in the corner. It was her silent signature. He started, visiting the same cafe over the next few weeks. Not every day, but whenever he felt homesick. He would arrive early, sit in the same corner, and order the same coffee. Eleanor served him with the same kindness, but she treated him like any other customer. That was what tore him apart, realizing that she had moved on, that she had left behind what was still everything to him. She never spoke about the past. She never brought up what had happened. And as much as Ethan desperately wanted a second act, he understood that that story had already ended for her. One morning, he watched her help a child choose a cupcake. It was a neighbor's daughter, he later learned, but there was so much sweetness in the way she bent down to listen to the girl, so much affection in her eyes, that Ethan realized something deeper. Eleanor was living, not waiting, not dragging herself through memories. She had chosen the peace he had never known how to offer. On the way back, he parked the car on the edge of a random lake and stood there, looking at the reflection of his own image in the murky water. He thought about all the times he had the chance to say, "Stay." He thought about the dinners alone, the restrained smiles, the averted glances. And he thought, above all, about cowardice. Because he loved, but he didn't have the courage to make this love a real home. He preferred to hide her, to keep her between walls that he thought were safe. But love is not made to live locked away. Love needs space, light. And she had flown away. Ethan's trips to the small town became less frequent. not for lack of desire, but out of respect. Each trip left a trail of deeper silence in him, as if his own heart was slowly learning to give up. He understood, now clearly, that there was nothing left to hope for. There was no reconciliation hidden in time, nor a dramatic scene of return. What there was a story that came to an end the very moment he chose pride. And living with this certainty was a kind of penance that he fulfilled in silence. Back at the mansion, an old proposal began to take shape in his mind. It was a project that Eleanor had mentioned once between coffees, a shelter for women without support, without a home, without a voice. She spoke with shining eyes, saying that one day she would use her savings to open a space like that. Ethan, at the time, just nodded with an empty, distracted smile. But now, those words echoed like a mission he needed to fulfill. Not out of guilt, but out of truth. For the first time he wanted to build something that made sense, something that had her soul, even without her presence. He gathered lawyers, architects, and partners. He bought a discreet piece of land and decided not to use her name on the project. He would simply call the place Aurora, in honor of what Elena meant, the beginning of the day, the first sign of light, the silent beginning of all that was good. It was a way of honoring her without stealing anything from her, without tarnishing with grandeur what had always been simple. While the project was underway, Ethan continued his reduced routine. He lived more in silence, read the books he had previously left as decoration, learned to make his own coffee. It was a way of reconnecting with what he had lost, or perhaps of becoming someone she could have loved in the light of day, even if it was too late. One day, when he visited the coffee shop, he found it closed. A note on the door read, "Closed for special reasons, will be back soon." Something in his chest tightened. He returned 3 days later. It was open. Elena was there. But there was something new, a discreet ring on her left hand. She greeted him with a serene smile and served him with the same sweetness. There was no explanation, no need. Her world had moved on, and surprisingly, Ethan felt peace. There was no anger, no jealousy, no despair, only a deep respect for everything she was, and for everything he had never known. There, sitting before her for the last time, he understood that true love is not what you have, but what you recognize, even when it is too late to go back. The following months were spent in silent construction. Ethan didn't announce the project, didn't hold a press conference, didn't use his last name. He simply watched, with a watchful eye, each wall that was built, each room that took shape. The Aurora shelter began to emerge as an extension of something he had never had the courage to say, but which he was now trying to transform into a gesture. There was no luxury, no ostentation, just dignity. Rooms with simple beds, wide windows, a garden in the center with wooden benches, and an open kitchen where the smell of cake always reminded one of an old home. All of that seemed small compared to the empire he managed, but it carried a value that no stock market share could translate. One morning, while visiting the nearly completed project, he came across a new volunteer cataloging donated books. She had Elena's calm demeanor, her gentle gestures, and eyes that seemed to have seen much of the world. She didn't recognize him, and that comforted him. It was good to be just another person there. For the first time in years, he felt part of something real, something clean. She offered him coffee, strong, unsweetened, just the way Elena liked it, and he smiled with a kind of gratitude he couldn't even express. The shelter opened on a cloudy afternoon with no spotlights, just a few women sitting on makeshift chairs, listening to simple words of welcome. Ethan didn't go up on stage or give a speech. He stood in the background, observing. When the coordinator mentioned that the place had been designed by someone who believed that all women deserved a safe space to start over, he looked down, and there, in that moment, he felt something inside him reorganize, as if part of the guilt had finally transformed into purpose. That night, back at the mansion, Ethan turned on all the porch lights. He sat in the same chair where years before Elena had silently dined with him. He placed 2 plates on the table. There was no food, no company, but it was his way of asking for forgiveness, not with words, but with presence. He stayed there until dawn, watching the sky change colors, and when the first light touched his face, he understood why she called it dawn. From that day on, he began to visit the shelter frequently. He helped as much as he could. Read to the children who arrived there with injured mothers, and planted flowers in the garden. No one there knew his past. They didn't call him sir or boss. They just called him Ethan, and that was more than he deserved. It was enough. Time passed more slowly after that. Ethan found in simple gestures the peace he never found in negotiations or headlines. The routine at the shelter transformed him from the inside out. The days had a more human rhythm. He changed light bulbs, fixed faucets, helped unload boxes, as if each task redeemed him a little. The place had become more than a project. It was his attempt to give back to the world what he had destroyed with his silence. No one there asked questions. No one wanted to know where his money came from, his sadness or his change. That comforted him. For the first time, he could just be. One afternoon, while stacking donated books, he came across an old copy of short stories. Opening it, he found a handwritten inscription. May you never lack the courage to start over. It was a simple sentence, unsigned, but the touch of the handwriting made him pause. He remembered how Elena would fold kitchen papers with little notes hidden inside, messages she herself had forgotten she had left. He closed the book carefully as if holding something too fragile, and placed it on a special shelf in the shelter's makeshift library. That night, it rained heavily. Ethan decided to sleep right there, in the small room reserved for volunteers. He listened to the storm beating on the thin tiles and thought about how his life had changed. From the luxury of dinners with people who barely looked each other in the eye, to the quiet of a space where a hug was more valuable than any speech. And in the midst of the darkness, for the first time in a long time, he cried. He cried without fear, without control, as if he were cleaning his chest of the last guilt that still hurt. The next day, he received a letter with no return address. A beige envelope discreetly left on his bed at the shelter. Inside, just a sheet of paper with a few lines. I'm glad you found your place. Some pains don't need to be screamed to stop hurting. Some absences are not losses, they are bridges. Thank you for everything. Elena. His hands shook. The handwriting was hers, but there was no address, no promise. Just peace stamped on each word. It was a farewell, not bitter, not cold, but final. And as much as it broke him inside, it also healed him. Over. Time. Ethan stopped looking for her on street corners, in coffee shops, in souvenirs. He started looking for her in her gestures, in her care for others, in the way she made coffee, in the notes she left for the children at the shelter, and above all, in the way she began to treat her feelings, as something that is honored in public, not hidden in fear, because understanding someone's value too late is a pain without a name. But honoring this love with truth, even after it ends, is the only way to transform it into eternity. The following spring, the shelter's garden bloomed like never before. White daisies, which he had planted, inspired by Eleanor's favorite flowers, spread around the courtyard, lightly touching the windows. The women who lived there began to care for the plants with the same care they dedicated to their children. It was as if this space, born from the regret of one man, now blossomed from the hope of many. And Ethan, quiet as ever, walked through the flower beds as if apologizing without words, without expecting forgiveness, simply planting what he had once destroyed. He now wrote notes, small, simple ones, left under doors. You are stronger than you think. It's not too late to start over. Someone believes in you. He never signed them. He never said it was him. But everyone knew. There was something in the papers, in the writing, in the care with which each fold was made, that revealed the man behind that gesture. It was his way of speaking to the world, the same way she spoke to him, with a silence that welcomes. Ethan also began to discreetly organize the shelter's library. I catalogued books, cleaned covers, and glued torn pages with clear tape. One afternoon, he found a girl reading a poetry book by herself. She was a teenager who had run away from home and was now rebuilding her life there. She looked at him and asked, "Have you ever fallen in love with someone you couldn't love?" He smiled without looking up from the book he was tidying, and replied, "Yes, and I've never been the same again." The girl nodded, as if she understood, and the two of them remained there, in silence, like two generations marked by different pains, but stitched together by the same absence of words. That question echoed for days, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he had never admitted it so clearly before. It was then that he realized he had never truly loved anyone other than her. Every relationship he had tried since had been shadows, comparisons, or attempts to fill a space that would accept no substitute. Elena wasn't just someone he had let go. She was the mirror of the man he could have been if he had chosen love over pride. In the last week of that month, Ethan arrived at the shelter with an envelope. Inside was the document that officially transferred the entire property to an independent foundation made in Elena Dorsey's name, not as a donation in her name, but as an acknowledgement of where it all came from. He didn't want public tributes. He wanted quiet justice. He wanted her name to exist in a place of hope, that, even without being there, she would be remembered as the woman who taught the coldest man in town how to feel. And so it was that little by little, Ethan stopped being just the silent founder of the shelter. He became the man who walked between the rooms with a look that carried memories, who smiled little, but with truth, and who, in each small gesture, left the mark of a love that, even though not lived, became eternal in what it transformed. That fall the city was covered in golden hues and gentle winds. The leaves fell as gently as time withdrew from the scene. The Aurora shelter was celebrating its second anniversary. There was no party, no speeches, just a collective coffee in the garden with low laughter and children running among the trees. Ethan arrived early. He carried with him a small, dark wooden box. He didn't tell anyone what was inside. He sat on one of the stone benches and remained there for hours, watching the movement of a world that finally made sense, even without him at the center. The sky began to close in on a light grey. The wind blew memories into the air, and it was in this silence that she appeared. Elena. She walked slowly through the entrance to the shelter, as if she had known that this day was special. She was wearing a simple blouse, her hair loose, and a scarf tied around her neck. The years had passed gently over her. Ethan looked up, and for a second he thought he was dreaming, but she was there, real, present, with the same look in her eyes as before, only stronger, freer, more whole than she had ever been. They didn't exchange words. She just walked over to him and sat down beside him. They sat there for long minutes looking at the garden where so many stories were beginning, until she asked, "Can I see it?" He handed her the box, his hands shaking. Inside was just one thing, the embroidered napkin she had left. On the tray that last night, carefully preserved, next to a note he had never had the courage to give her. It said simply, "You have always been my home. I just haven't had the courage to move." Eleanor read it silently. Then she closed the box gently and handed it back to him. She didn't cry, she didn't smile. She just looked at him and said, "You've built something beautiful," even if it was later. Ethan lowered his eyes. He wanted to say so much, but his throat wouldn't allow it, until she finished. "I needed to come here, not to go back, but to see with my own eyes that love, even when it fails, can still bear fruit." She stood up, walked to the entrance, and before leaving she turned around one last time. Her eyes held no pain or resentment, just a kind of longing that had already made peace with time, and with a subtle gesture, an almost imperceptible wave, she said goodbye to him forever. Ethan stood there, alone, box on his knees, but for the first time, he didn't feel lonely. He felt complete, as if that cycle had finally ended in the most dignified way possible, not with romantic reconciliation, nor with forced endings, but with the truth being accepted as it is, raw, symbolic, and irreversible. In the following years, the Aurora shelter grew. It became a reference. It received support from other businessmen, anonymous donations, and spread seeds in neighboring cities. But what no one knew was that, next to the garden, under the shade of the oldest tree, Ethan had the small wooden box buried, a silent act, a symbolic tomb for a love that he never lived as he should have, a gesture of humility and also of redemption. And so he went on, dedicating his days to caring for lives that still had time. And every morning, before anything else, he would pass by the shade of that tree, place his hand on the ground and whisper a single phrase, "Good morning, Elena." He didn't expect an answer. He didn't need one anymore, because some loves don't come back. But they make us better forever. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment. Some loves change us forever. Like the video if you felt his silent pain. Subscribe now to never miss a story that speaks directly to the soul. And while you're here, take advantage. The video that's appearing on the screen now will move you even more. Click and let yourself feel it.